So are you a global warming skeptic, or are you skeptical of the global warming skeptics? Anyway, so this is one of those interesting transitions from a in my opinion anyway, what used to be a legitimate scientific debate to more like the birthers and the truthers, those who are still skeptical, I think, in which you either follow the data when there's new data and you change your mind, or you just say, now I want the grade school transcripts, as Colbert said, and no amount of data will ever make any difference. So that's the difference between a sort of a scientific belief, which is a type of belief system, but it's open to change, versus an ideology or political or economic ideology, which is a principle you hold no matter what the data says. So that's the difference between scientific beliefs and all other beliefs. And I for a long time was kind of skeptical of a lot of the claims, because when I was in college in the 70s, all the doomsdayers made all these horrific predictions of horrific outcomes that didn't happen. So I thought, well, maybe this is an area for skepticism. And then I actually started reading the primary literature in the 2000s. And actually, Tim, your book, The Weather Makers, was sort of the last thing that tipped it over. It's like you put it all together, and you came here and gave that great lecture, and it's like, you know what, I think it's time to flip that belief, because the data is there. So that was the last time you were here, and that was terrific. So Tim's now touring. He was just here at the book festival yesterday, the LA Times Book Festival, from Australia. His new book is Here on Earth, A Natural History of the Planet. Tim was born in Melbourne in 1956. Oh, a youngster. 2 years younger than me. Okay, so he's a writer, scientist, and explorer. He has written many award-winning books, including The Future Eaters, Throw 'em Wayleg. I remember that book that was like in the early 90s, I think. That's a Australian Aborigines phrase, right? Throw 'em Wayleg. That was a great book. And The Eternal Frontier, an international bestseller. Of course, The Weather Makers we have over there, by the way, as well as his lecture for us last time. He is the National Geographic Society's Australian representative and a director of the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, and was recently named Australia's first Chief Commissioner for Climate Change. In 2007, Tim was named Australian of the Year. I think that's so cool. We have nothing like that in America, right? We have like the Sports Illustrated cover model. We have, this is just, no wonder we have educational problems here. We need a scientist, the Australian of the Year. Now, how cool is that? And in 2010, he was awarded the prestigious Joseph Leidy Award by the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences. The book is Here on Earth, A Natural History of the Planet. We'll do the lecture, Q&A, book signing over here. Please help me welcome Dr. Tim Flannery.
All right. So let's put that, I guess, maybe like that.
Right, thank you. Well, thanks so much, Michael, for that warm welcome. And, it's just wonderful to be back here. I can't believe it's 5 years since I was here last at Caltech. And all of that 5 years has been filled in really with me trying to write this book. It arose out of questions that I was asked in places like this when I was talking about the Weather Makers. And the questions usually went something like, well, what are our chances of surviving all this? It all sounds pretty grim, terrible circumstances. The climate issue has crept up on us without us being aware of it. And what are our chances of surviving? And the only way I could think of to address that question seriously was to go back to the beginning, go back to the Earth system that we're influencing and try to get a better understanding of how it works and what its limits are. And also to take a new look at our species, and that's incredibly hard to do because we're it. It's like the brain trying to analyse itself, and sometimes you've got to step out of that, try to look at it through a mirror backwards or through a pinhole or something, just to get a different perspective on it. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But really, the reason I needed to do that was because the environmental problems we face, they occur at the junction of our planetary systems and its ability to support life, and our interference, our impacts on those systems. I just put the two covers of the book up here as a warning for any budding authors in the audience. You don't always get a chance to control everything about your book, even though you work on it for 5 years, pretty hard. On the left, you've got it's actually on your left, the Australian copy, the cover, and then the American cover on the right. The Australian one I didn't have a lot of control over, but when it was sent off to my American publisher, he just looked at it and said, "That looks like the cover of Watchtower. It's not going to work here." It's not going to work here in the US. Mind you, Australians don't quite see it that way, but he's absolutely right. It was. So he gave her that beautiful cover there with the old geological map on it, which is in some ways much more in tune with the message of the book. So when you look at the planet and when you look at ourselves, you've really got to go back to the origin and the man who explained it all. And this is his gravestone here in Westminster Abbey. I made the pilgrimage to see good old Charles Darwin at rest there. It's a fantastic place. I love the way the British take all of their ancestors and stick them in the ancestor house, the House Tamboran that they call Westminster Abbey. They even classify them, so you get all the poets together and all the, the scientists and so forth. And there's often a little bit of a story about what they did, which is just brilliant. It's like a New Guinean House Tamboran, really. But this guy here, it's a very different treatment. This is the man who changed the world, right? Who gave us our understanding of where we came from, where our, where life or how life has progressed over the billions of years, and yet there's no mention of it there on the tombstone. I think that at that stage, Charles Darwin and the Anglican Church weren't quite the best of friends for reasons that we will soon have a look at. Just trying to understand what Darwin was saying and his milieu when he said it led me not only to Westminster Abbey but to Down House in Kent, where Darwin lived most of his adult life. And the place I really wanted to see there was not so much the house, although that was very interesting, but was this here. This is called rather mysteriously the Sand Walk, and even at that distance you can see there's no sand at all, it's pebbles, so why Darwin called it the Sand Walk is beyond me, but he did. He had that built beside his house. It's in shape, it's rather like a racetrack. It's just a big oval. And it was Darwin's habit to walk around the Sand Walk every day that he could do it, for several hours at a time. Scientists have long speculated about what Darwin was doing as he was walking, what he was thinking as he walked around the Sand Walk. And the conventional view is that he was perhaps deeply engaged in thinking about his theory and about some specific aspects of it, or the research he was conducting on that day. Or perhaps he was crafting the beautiful and elegant sentences that characterised his writing. I just don't think that's right. I read biographies by Darwin's children of their father, and in that one of the children recollects playing on the Sand Walk. You can imagine the kids, he had a big family, they must have loved the place. Kicking a ball around, playing cowboys and Indians, I don't know what they did back then, but playing Robin Hood probably, something like that. And they often interrupted their father, and they recall that, doing it. And Darwin always welcomed the interruption. That's not the actions of a man who is deeply engaged in thought about a specific complex problem. I think what Darwin was doing as he was walking around the loop, the Sand Walk, was fingering his metaphorical worry beads. He was trying to think through the implications of his theory for his own society. I suspect that is at base what he was doing. He sat on the theory for 20 years, and who knows how long he would have sat on it without releasing it if it hadn't been for that man, for Alfred Russel Wallace, fellow scientist, ultimately the co-founder of the theory of evolution with Darwin, and a more different man from Charles Darwin that ever existed. Darwin was the ultimate careful, methodical reductionist scientist, a man of infinite patience, enormous, organisational capacity, incredibly methodical in his work. Wallace was different. Of course, Darwin was a member of the establishment. Wallace was a working class lad, had to be taken out of school at an early age because his family couldn't afford to educate him. He went off ultimately to the tropics to earn a living as a biological collector. And it was while he was there on the island of Ternate around early 1858 that he suffered a malarial attack. And in the midst of the malarial attack came up with this vision of how species were created, how life, all the diversity of life came about. His ideas were pretty much identical to Darwin's. In fact, Wallace wrote a letter when he recovered from his malaria explaining what he'd discovered. And when Darwin received that letter, he was shocked and astonished, because he said, you know, this guy couldn't have made a better précis of my ideas if he had my notes in front of him. So great minds thinking alike, but very, very different sorts of minds. As a result of Wallace prompting Darwin, the Linnaean Society of July 25, 1858 carried 2 papers side by side establishing the theory of evolution. And it's incredibly simple. It really is what Darwin and Wallace discovered. It's just that there is variation in any population, and some variants, some individuals, are more fitted to thrive and leave offspring in the situation they find themselves than others. And that over the depth of geological time that was just then being discovered, that process has led to the diversity of all life on Earth. That in a nutshell is it. You would have thought that the theory would have shook the world immediately, but there was almost no reaction initially. In fact, the president of the society, Mr. I think Thomas Bell, who was an expert on the stalk-eyed crustacea, when he was summarising the research for the year in the Linnaean Society Journal, said, you know, nothing really important much has happened, nothing that's going to shake the foundations of any department of science we're concerned with. Couldn't have been more wrong, because the following year, Charles Darwin published his On the Origin of Species with a rather delicious subtitle that ends with something like, and the preservation of favoured races, which is something I'll come back to in a moment. Before we go on, well no, actually we should look at Darwin first, because every experimenter affects the experiment, and Darwin's release of his great work had a transformational impact on his society, I believe. And some of the great worries that Darwin had, I think, became very real. And just to put it in a personal perspective for the man, you know, on July 25, 1858, neither Wallace nor Darwin could be at the Linnaean Society. Wallace, obviously, because he was in what's now Indonesia. Darwin, because he was at the graveside of his son, Charles Robert Darwin, his namesake, who, aged 18 months, had died a day or two before. And I can imagine Darwin sitting or standing there beside his grieving wife, Emma, a deeply religious woman, who, if she ever needed the consolation of religion, must surely have been on that day. And Darwin fully understanding that at that moment his great idea was being released on the world, an idea that would lead people to believe that they were not the creation of a loving God with an individual stake in them and their existence, but were instead the creation of an unspeakably cruel and amoral process that only has variation and death with which to work. That theory resonated, as I said, through 19th century societies. Within 5 years, Herbert Spencer, the great social scientist, had coined the phrase survival of the fittest to encapsulate Darwinian thinking in the social sphere as well. And I'm sure that phrase of Darwin's on the preservation of favoured races came back to haunt him, because if I was going in to buy books in 19th century Britain and I went into a bookshop and saw a book on the preservation of favoured races, I don't think I'd be thinking about worms that were just a little bit better at being worms than the others. I think I would have been thinking of the British Empire builders out in India and other places who were clearly the favoured races. They were, in a survival of the fittest world, they were surviving. And that theory, for better or worse, gave rise to a number of social movements that I think were extremely negative for our society. They include the obvious, such as the rise of National Socialism in Germany in the early 20th century, through to the establishment of eugenic societies around the world. I think they had a big impact as well, that survival of the fittest view, on things like neoclassical economics, this belief that the free market system is somehow good for people. You know, a survival of the fittest world is good for us. We'll come back to a survival of the fittest world a bit later on and all of its implications, but I just want to point out here that was not the only way to read evolution. And Alfred Russel Wallace spent his entire life pursuing quite a different view of what the implications of evolution were for our society. At the age of 80, he published, I think, one of the most extraordinary books ever to be published in the English language. That's the title page there. It's called Man's Place in the Universe, a study of the results of scientific research in relation to the unity or plurality of worlds. So what the hell was Wallace about? Wallace was always interested in evolution's legacy. You know, Darwin was interested in the mechanism, and the reductionist scientific school that was established in universities around the world following Darwin's theory has always been, or by and large until recently, a reductionist scientific school. We can see its most recent flowerings in the work of Richard Dawkins, for example. That particular school of thought has done great works in terms of elucidating the mechanism of evolution, but it is very limited in what it can tell us about the nature of the world we live in. And this came home to me so strongly when I was reading Dawkins and The Selfish Gene, a brilliant book, without doubt, and a great advance in terms of our understanding of the evolutionary process. But I remember reading Dawkins's words on motherhood, and he said, you know, the smile of a child is an attempt to trick the mother, and it satisfies her much as food in the stomach of a rat satisfies a rat in a maze. And I thought, you know, Richard, you're right about the mechanism maybe, you've got an insight there, but what you've just written shows me how utterly impossible it is to explain the world we live in through purely reductionist terms, through selfish gene terms. The love between a mother and a child is so much different from what Dawkins was trying to point out. That there's another way, I think, of explaining this. And I think Wallace was the man who actually stumbled on this. What he understood was that evolution's legacy is not about cruelty or anything else. It's about collaboration, cooperation, and co-evolution. That's what it really is. Paradoxically, that is the outcome of this unspeakably cruel and amoral process, is an integrated world. How integrated is one? I should just speak about Man in the Universe briefly, so I don't leave you hanging with that. It's the foundation text of astrobiology. In it, Wallace argues that Earth is the only living planet. He discusses the atmosphere, the nature of the atmosphere, and the impact of life on the atmosphere in a way that foreshadows James Lovelock's Gaia theory and Earth system science as a whole. And he rails against air pollution. Says how outrageous it is that this criminal activity stunting the bodies of working class Englishmen all over the country. An extraordinary person. So what did he discover? In Wallace's 4-page summary of evolution by natural selection, he speculates about what happens to organisms in a country long unchanged. And that phrase set me thinking. That's when you get coevolution occurring. Country long unchanged. Not surprising that he used that phrase. He was in a country long unchanged. The rainforests of Southeast Asia have many archaic species surviving in them, and arguably are a region in many ways long unchanged. It's worth even looking at our own bodies just to understand the full depth of what Wallace was trying to tell us. You know, on my skin I've got hundreds of species of fungus and bacteria and virus, probably more. I do wash, even though I'm an Australian, I wash regularly, but they're still there, you know, they're still there. And in fact, you know, 10% of my body by mass is not me in a conventional sense. It is bugs that live on me and in me and with me. You know, some of them are quite big. I mean, I've got, you know, every one of us has mites that live on the human eyebrows and nowhere else on the planet. Another species lives at the base of human eyelashes. You know, in fact, life is so pervasive on me, if you were to take me away, if you want, and left the bugs, you'd see a shadow outline of me in great detail because they're very specific with where they live. And we cannot live without them. We are utterly dependent upon many of these bugs for our life. we're just learning that with modern medical science. Various diseases, a good example is Crohn's disease, has been tied to our elimination of our fellow travellers. In the case of Crohn's disease, it's hookworm, very large parasite by most standards. Without hookworm, a certain percentage of the population has an immune reaction to their own bodies and ends up getting Crohn's disease. It's treated now with hookworm. People can buy hookworm over the internet and inoculate themselves. But the coevolution of life goes even further than that. And I should just point out that, I mean, what that means for us is that we are entities of near planetary ecological complexity ourselves, right? So we are, the coevolution that is in us is extraordinary. But it goes deeper than that, because these little things here, these mitochondria, they're in every one of our cells. They're the power packs for our cells. We can't exist for a millisecond without them. They can't exist without us. And yet they're not of us. They started life 1 billion years ago in a long changed ocean as free-living bacteria that came to live in our cells, a bit like the way algae have come to live in the cells of coral polyps. And coevolution has bound us so tightly together that it took until very recent decades for scientists to comprehend that these things have a separate origin from what we think of as our cells, the eukaryotic cells of our own body. At the global level, what has coevolution created? In other words, what is Gaia? There's a widespread belief in society that the Gaia theory is some sort of, I don't know, very soft science that's sort of almost verging on New Age thinking. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, if you read Lovelock, you'll see he's a very rigorous thinker who understood that the sum of all interactions between life have created an extraordinary thing in this planet here, the only living planet we know about. The impact of life on this thing is deep. Nothing much comes into it but sunlight, nothing much goes out but heat. And life captures enough energy from the sun, about 4% of the sunlight that falls on the planet, to command an energy budget that is around 100 terawatts. That's an enormously big energy budget, far bigger than humans control. And with it, over the last 4 billion years, arguably life has made this thing. Maybe not the deep rocks, but down to 100 kilometres made it. And one of the great insights we've had just over the last couple of years from scientists is that even the continental rocks, this is Africa here, result at least in part from the energy budget commanded by life. The argument is that the rocks of the oceans, the oceanic crust, have to be eroded to create continental rocks, and that looking at the energy budget of the early planet and what we know about the formation of continents, there just wasn't enough energy on the early Earth to create the continents in the manner and in the time that we know they formed. Life, it seems, captured energy and hastened the erosional process by creating acids and so forth, giving the additional energy that was required to create the continents, or help create the continents. It's humbling for me to think that the earth beneath my feet is a manifestation of life in part, just as much as the atmosphere and the oceans are. So what is the energy used for here? The best way I can think of explaining how life's energy budget is used is that it's used to create an imbalance between the three principal organs of planet Earth: the rocks, the waters, and the atmosphere. On a dead planet, they're in chemical balance, they're at chemical rest, there's nothing to disturb the equilibrium, chemical equilibrium of the three great organs of the planet. On Earth, that's not the case. The oceans, we know how they've changed through time as life has exerted its influence. The atmosphere, James Lovelock argues, is 99% created by life. Yeah? So 99% of the gases we breathe are actually made by life. They're a manifestation of life every bit as much as a bird's feather is, or a hair, when I used to have hair, from myself. Not living, but a manifestation of life. The difference is the atmosphere and the Earth system as a whole is a manifestation of life as a whole. It's not really like an organism. The connectivity is too loose. It's more like an ecosystem, but some would argue more closely tied than an ecosystem. It has some capacity of self-regulation, the system, and it regulates through what I call in my book geopheromones. In other words, very rare elements in the Earth system that have a great capacity to convey a message to the rest of the system. Some of those rare elements are the greenhouse gases that keep temperatures on the planet habitable for life. Others help create the cloud systems that are important parts of the weather system and play various roles. Others, such as atmospheric dust, have other roles to play. Another way of thinking about this great entity is just with this little aphorism here: information systems organise matter. Right? The information system that's organised my body is DNA. It's the blueprint of my body, and it's organised matter into my body. At the planetary level, the information system of DNA, the blueprint for all life, has created this system, or organised matter, into that particular kind of system. I'd like to turn now to an intermediate level of organisation on planet Earth, which is very important for understanding what we as a species are or are becoming. And that level of organisation is called the superorganism. The basic work in this area has been done by E.O. Wilson and Bert Holdobler and many other colleagues looking at social insects. And it is particularly important for the message that I want to talk about today. This is a civilization, if you want, maybe a kind of skyscraper. And these creatures here are the descendants of cockroaches that discovered agriculture, because that's all that termites are. Yeah? They're cockroaches that 100 million years ago discovered agriculture and so started building these great superorganisms. You can see here these are all one species, just one colony, in fact, all of these termites, and yet they all look very different. That's because in a superorganism, the individuals all do specific jobs in such a way that creates a hierarchy of organisation that's intermediate, really, between the organisation of the cells in a body and the organisation of elements in an ecosystem. It's an intermediate stage of organisation. It clearly promotes great interdependency. No individual elements in a superorganism can do all of the jobs that the superorganism requires to be done. And we can think again, if you just think of this in the simplest terms, that what happens in a superorganism, as the superorganism becomes more perfect and more competent and more powerful, so does the autonomy and power of the individual decline, yeah? Because we become interdependent one upon the other. Thinking about these sort of levels of organisation and their application to politics goes very, very deep indeed. It was Plato 2,500 years ago that talked about the ideal government or the ideal society. And he said, in an ideal society, there's no difference between mine and thine. Yeah? And that's what he was describing was this system. Yeah? There is no difference between the interests of the individual termite and that of the colony they belong to. And that's because there is a strong genetic uniformity within that group. Not total, but strong, particularly for the large complex superorganisms within that group. I would argue that us humans have formed a superorganism, but a very, very different one from that of the social insects. Because in our societies, despite the best efforts of Karl Marx and others, there is and will always be a difference between mine and thine. Yeah? We're selfish, individual, upright apes. We're not social insects. That doesn't mean that we haven't formed or in the process of forming a superorganism. Here you see the origins of the human superorganism, and what is truly astonishing about this, as Jared Diamond points out in his book, Guns, Germs and Steel, that not only did we form a superorganism once as humans, but 5 separate times within 5,000 years. Never in the history of the planet, 4 billion years, has a warm-blooded creature formed a superorganism. Then at the end of the last ice age, one species does it 5 times separately. It's as if we have a great propensity to do this, to form a superorganism in a way that no other species has. The first people to start forming a superorganism were in the Fertile Crescent, the Middle East, domesticating wheat, various other species 11,000 years ago or so. Then in East Asia, perhaps 9,000 years ago, with the domestication of millet and rice. On the island of New Guinea, with the domestication of taro, sugarcane and so forth. And then in the Americas, around 5,500 years ago, with the domestication of other crops. What holds our human superorganisms together? If genetic relatedness holds together the social insects, what holds us together? There are only two forms of superorganismic glue that I can think of that are strong enough to hold human civilizations together. One is the division of labour, an extraordinarily powerful force. The division of labour, as it was discussed by Adam Smith, is capable of explaining the enormous productivity of our civilizations and also of those of the ants. It's extraordinarily potent as a force. You just think about the history of cities. You know, for most of civilization's history, cities have been population sinks. That means that if you come into a city, you're much more likely to die than if you stay in the countryside. And yet human beings have persistently come into cities in great numbers, risking death, just because the benefits of sitting down at the table of the division of labour are so great. Right? We benefit. We are each other's greatest resource in a superorganism, yeah? Because we can provide things effectively that are of enormous benefit to us. As the human superorganisms have come into contact with each other, there's been catastrophe as well as benefits. It was Francis Bacon who talked about the impact of paper, compasses and gunpowder on Europe. Of course, all of that came from here into this one. Ideas have swapped back and forth, as have crops. The great interchanges that characterise our civilisation have tended to enrich us all. So just to finish off on the division of labour, ants have also discovered the division of labour. It's interesting that for the social insects, genetic uniformity is the base. It's the glue that the system started off with. That means that the primitive social insects are always monogamous. One male, one female, because you want to limit genetic diversity in the offspring. Yeah? For the more complex social insects, such as the attine ants, the females are polyandrous. A queen will mate with multiple males because that gives her even more diversity with which to create the working guilds or the working castes of insects, the great diversity of them that are required in the most complex insect superorganisms, but it also weakens the genetic relatedness. I think in those insect societies it's the division of labour that is taking up the slack created by the additional genetic diversity. And those superorganisms can be enormous. 5 to 8 million individuals working together in great complex civilisations that on their scale and complexity rival that of Elizabethan England. They're huge. Sure, they didn't have Shakespeare, but they've got a lot of complexity. The other form of superorganismic glue that holds us together is belief, a common view, a common belief system, and that tends to, or at least a tolerance of other belief. When you think about religion as a form of belief holding together our superorganismic glue, it's not a particularly good one because I think I'm right if I'm religious and you think you're right if you've got another religion, and it's hard to reconcile that, yeah? You need a different sort of superorganismic glue perhaps as our global civilisation reaches maturity. I've gone, something's happened there, I've skipped. Oh no, I haven't. No, I'm right. Good. I just want to return to that question then, having had a brief look at what we are and our world, but not completely followed through with the thoughts. Revisit the question I started with, whether we are destined to crash and burn as a species or whether we can have a more sustainable future. Are we so selfish and greedy that we will destroy ourselves and other life? Or can we, through the process of coevolution, create a more complex and productive interrelationship with our planet? Peter Ward's marvellous book, which I really recommend to you, The Medea Hypothesis, champions one view in a very fulsome manner. Peter argues that it has always been a property of life to destroy life. That if you take the very long view, the billion-year view, you'll see that life has, as it's become successful, destroyed the foundations of its own success. Quite often through a build-up of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that have then interfered with the oceanic circulation and then brought about a great extinction event. And Peter would argue that what we're seeing today in the world with what humans are doing is no different from any of those particular prehistoric extinction events. I find it's a good book, a useful book, but I don't think it's right. And I can be straightforward with that, because what it's based on is a foundation in a survival of the fittest world. This world isn't a survival of the fittest world. In a survival of the fittest world, it'd be like a survival of the fittest football competition, right? You might have a great competition and have a winner at the end of the year, but after that you won't have a competition anymore because there'll only be the winner. Yeah? That's not the world we live in, right? Very different, complex series of outcomes. But it's that sort of idea linked with an awareness of the acute environmental problems we face, I think, that is at the basis of Peter's book. My book is a little bit different. I think that what I argue is that the evolutionary process has slightly loaded the dice in our favour in order to survive. I just want to run through a few reasons for hope, and this is very small type, so I'm going to be very quick for the people at the back. We just need to know that we're winning some really important environmental battles. The Stockholm Convention bans persistent organic pollutants. These are things that as soon as they're made, we know they're going to end up in our bodies. They bioaccumulate. 2004, the convention entered into force, and it is a very powerful convention. It bans outright these chemicals. It also mandates that the rich countries help the poor in terms of moving away from these chemicals. Revised as recently as August 2010 to include new POPs, new dangerous chemicals. Ozone depletion, another great example. Humanity somehow got together on the 16th of September 1987 and banned chemicals that were destroying Earth's ozone layer. Here's what would have happened if we hadn't ratified the Montreal Protocol. That's 1974, that's 2060. Ozone depleting, there's your colour there, giving you the extent of depletion. Until 2060, we're living in a world without the protection ozone brings us. That sort of world is not tenable for life as we know it. You know, the sort of sunburn you get today from being outside for 20 minutes, in that world you'd get in a matter of seconds. For each percentage increase in ultraviolet radiation at the surface of the planet, you get a percentage decrease in crop germination. You get a percentage increase in blindness for anything with eyes. So we saved ourselves with the Montreal Protocol. I really think that this Montreal Protocol will be, or the 16th of September, will be celebrated one day as the first great humanistic day of global celebration. It was the first time we got together and meaningfully cooperated to deal with a global environmental problem. And just for those who might worry that the big ozone hole this year is suggesting that we are going backwards, we're not. The data's very clear. There's ozone decline, it's flattening out. Varies a lot year to year depending on temperatures over the poles, but here's the bottom line, the ozone layer is recovering. Sometimes we've been able to deal with really complex and difficult situations. This little chemical here, diclofenac, I don't know what you call it in the USA, but in Australia it's diclofenac. We use it for inflammation and gout and all those sort of things, so there may be some people in the audience who are familiar with it. It has been tied into the extinction or near extinction of vultures in South and East Asia. It was used as a veterinary medicine for a number of years in India. The vultures started vanishing so quickly that they were declining faster than the dodo was declining on Mauritius when it was heading towards extinction. Not just one species of vulture, but all of them. When this was discovered, there was great cause for concern just with the decline of vultures. The Parsi people of India exposed their dead in towers of silence. So this, you can still see them around Mumbai, where vultures come down and dismember the bodies and eat them. And the Parsis do that because they believe it's just wrong to pollute the four sacred elements of life: earth, fire, water, and air. So they prefer to recycle dead bodies back straight into living systems. With the vultures gone, the Parsis had incredible problems and continue to have problems disposing of their dead. But even more serious for India as a whole, the number of dogs, feral dogs, spread up dramatically, and there was great fear of a rabies outbreak that would be a threat to people throughout India. The government, when it realised what was happening, banned diclofenac as a veterinary treatment. It had almost no impact. And incidentally, you only need 1% of cattle carcasses to be containing diclofenac to exterminate all the vultures. 1%, very low levels. It causes acute kidney failure in them. So the government banned diclofenac, had no impact because an Indian with a sick cow would go off to the doctor and just say, gee, I've got a bad back this week, doc, can I have some diclofenac? And he'd then feed it to his cow. Right? The way this was actually dealt with was only through concerted community action. Groups such as the Council for Environmental Education India realised that there was substitute drugs on the market that could be used, but that they were all more expensive than diclofenac. So they began a program of reimbursements for farmers throughout India to try to encourage them to use these drugs. You can imagine how difficult it is in a country of 1 billion people where education and so forth is limited to do this, but we are now seeing success in terms of just a community groups addressing a very severe threat to biodiversity. There's many problems we haven't been able to overcome. Fisheries, regulating our great oceanic commons is one of them. The little graph down there, all you need to know really is that the green fisheries are the developing ones, the dark brown ones are those that have collapsed, and there's a timeline along the bottom from 1950 to 2000. You can see where we're heading, yeah? Despite the efforts we've made, we have had very little impact on that, and time is running out for us. So that's one area we haven't had success. In terms of resource overexploitation, into forest protection, we are changing things, and we're changing them because of new technology, in part, as well as an increasing realisation we need to do something. At the rate we were clearing forests until recently, there would have been no tropical forests outside protected areas by 2050. What's turned that around is satellite surveillance, and in places like the state of Pará in Brazil, people have used that satellite surveillance, which can almost go down to the level of individual trees in the rainforest, to work out where the illegal clearing's happening, where the cattle that are grazed on the new pastures are sold to abattoirs, and then who buys the meat from those abattoirs. And by putting all that together, they then just slap, or they have slapped recently, $1 billion fine on all of those participating in illegal activities. Very interesting how quickly it stopped illegal logging, illegal clearance in places like Brazil. There's no reason globally why we couldn't be applying that everywhere. It's simply government inaction and corruption that allow illegal logging to continue today. And it continues because there's a lot of people on the planet, at least in part, who have very little to lose, and because our democracies are incomplete. And where our democracies are incomplete, the power of the individual is insufficient to protect us from such things. And also we have great inequality, and people like these Somali pirates will risk everything just to get ahead. We could talk about this perhaps a bit more in question time, but the key message I want to get through to you here is that people who have nothing will risk all just to get something. They'll chop down the last tree, whatever else. But that is a socially flexible mechanism. Sure, we all have high individual discount rates, but people with something to lose are much more accountable to the future than those who don't. So issues of income equality, of equality of opportunity, and so forth now are critically relevant at a global level. Yeah? We can't insulate ourselves from those sort of things. One of the things that's happening as our great global superorganism is taking shape is that individuals are becoming empowered throughout the planet. This has all happened since I wrote the book, although I talked about this sort of, the possibility of this sort of thing happening. This is Tahrir Square in Egypt. These are people protesting for the empowerment of democracy. And you really need to live under a dictatorship for a little while to understand how corrosive it is of the essence of humanity. I lived in Indonesia for a while and saw dictatorships at first hand, and saw the capricious nature of the law, the sort of insurmountable difficulties and indignities people have to put up with every day of the week in such systems. So it's not surprising that that sort of thing is happening now. And I think that just in my lifetime, the world's changed. I mean, God, I grew up in a world where there was dictators still embedded in the heart of Western Europe. That's now gone. We're now seeing democracy sweep North Africa and the Middle East. My guess is that within 20, 30, 40 years, democracy will be the system that the great majority of us live under. And it's because of the social media, the interconnectedness of people, the great spread of ideas, mobile phones, the internet. These are the things that are empowering people in ways we've never seen before. So as the great global superorganism takes shape in a world of ever greater resource constraint, where the environment is becoming the key issue in many parts of the world, as people look to the future, what will Gaia look like in that new world? I've begun to wonder whether this great global intelligence that is taking shape before our eyes may not act as some sort of intelligence for planet Earth. After all, there is a good parallel with the nature of our own brain. Our brain is a really greedy and selfish organ. Yeah? It only weighs 2% of our body mass. It takes 20% of the energy that we take in with our food. It's greedy. It's also selfish. It'll close down oxygen and other resources to almost every other organ of the body before it deprives itself one iota. Yeah? It's sort of the quintessential human, the brain. It's like us individually. That doesn't mean that the brain is not a consummately good command and control system for our bodies. Yeah? It just needs to, it's self-limiting, and it needs to be self-limiting in the context of the body, but it can be greedy and selfish. Is there any possibility that humans are self-limiting? I think the demographic data is amazing in that regard. It should convince us all that at least in terms of population, we are self-limiting. Within 150 years, starting a century ago, it now appears that the entire human species is going to go through the demographic transition. So we go from large family size to a family size of around 2. That's a self-limiting species. Never in the history of the Earth has a species escaped the trap described by Thomas Malthus 2 centuries ago, where population continues to grow exponentially, and the food resource only grows arithmetically, and so populations collapse. We're the first species that have perhaps found a way around that, and we can talk a little bit in question time perhaps about some of the implications of that. But we are self-limiting in other ways too. We have created national parks. We have created rules around how we exploit certain resources, but it's an incomplete work. So what is Gaia like in terms of the context of the Earth system? James Lovelock, the man who came up with the Gaia hypothesis, said that Gaia is like an old lady who has to share her house with a growing and destructive group of teenagers. Gaia grows angry, and if they don't mend their ways, she'll evict them. In other words, the Medea hypothesis, yeah? That's what we get. I'm not sure that's right, because the Gaia that I see much more resembles a newborn baby. After all, newborns have newly formed brains, nervous systems and bodies, but these are yet to be fully integrated, so self-control and self-awareness remain rudimentary, and of course infancy is the most dangerous period of life. We have, or our Earth now perhaps has a new formed brain just in the process of forming. We have nervous systems in the form of all of our surveillance now across the surface of the planet, as well as our agricultural systems which deeply embed us within nature. And we have all of the geopheromones as the Earth has always had. But they're yet to be fully integrated because our brain hasn't taken full shape yet, and we haven't realised perhaps the position that we are in. When I think about that fundamental question that I began the lecture with, whether we'll survive or not, I sometimes think of it in terms of Fermi's paradox, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it. You know, the idea that Enrico Fermi, the Italian physicist, realised there's billions of stars out there, so why the great silence? Why aren't we hearing from other intelligent superorganisms? And that's what we have to hear from. Intelligent individuals will do nothing in terms of creating an entity powerful enough to send a message to another civilization. Right? Our ancestors were every bit as smart as us, but could never do what we've done. It takes the power of the superorganism to do what we've done. So if you look at Fermi's paradox, there's really only 2 explanations. And one is that perhaps Peter Ward is right. Perhaps intelligent superorganisms carry within themselves the seeds of their own destruction, and that therefore they are destroyed soon after they are given birth to, soon after they're born. But it's also possible, I think, that we genuinely are the first. And the reason I say that is that if you look at the history of not only the Earth, which is on the bottom line there, but the entire universe. You know, you realise it takes 3 generations of stars just to create the complex, the elements that we need to make life. You know, carbon, iron, and so forth. And that moment brings us right to the creation of the solar system and the Earth 4.5 billion years ago. You can see a few key moments on this timeline. The origin of life around 4 billion years ago. Life takes control of Earth's systems sometime after 3 billion years ago. Formation of the first superorganism 100 million years ago. First intelligent superorganism just 10,000 years ago. And if you let your fancy roam and think about the reproduction of Gaia, if Gaia is a newborn babe at the moment, when will she reach puberty? When will she reproduce? Well, at the speed we can travel through space now, it'll take just 5 million years to conquer the entire galaxy or colonise the entire galaxy. That's, for a paleontologist, that's no time at all, right? It might seem like a long time for us, but it's, in terms of Gaia, it's not a long time at all. So maybe we are the first. But whatever the case, I think that what is axiomatically true is that it's this generation that will make the important decisions. Because we live at the critical moment. We live at the moment of birth, the most dangerous moment in the life of any organism for this Gaian system of ours. Our population, our resource use, our ability to cooperate, our empathy for each other, they're the things that will answer the question that we all want answered, whether we have a long-term future or not. Thank you very much.
Wow, good stuff. Well, it's true. I think the way you phrase things like Dawkins is correct, but there's another way to tell the story. It's like one of the reasons people have a hard time accepting evolution. They don't know much about it. It just seems so cold, heartless, selfish, nasty, brutish. You know, nature red in tooth and claw, and you can say, well, but maybe being fit means being pro-social, cooperative, altruistic, and all that.
Yeah, yeah.
And people just kind of scratch their heads at that.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
So this is an interesting way to spin that.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, we probably have lots of questions, so I'll let you call them out.
So, yes.
What you see is the inexorable spread of democracy. When, how do you think we'll get mainland China?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it's already hit mainland China. The tensions now between the Communist Party and the people are ever more evident. My son, by the way, spent a year in Beijing and is a fluent Mandarin speaker, and he keeps me in touch with a lot of this. We're seeing experiments with democracy in China now at the lowest level, you know, when lowest level of government, the city level of government. And of course, the Communist Party itself, 1 in 12 Chinese belong to that, is a democratic institution in some ways. So, but when and how it will give way, who knows? But could I just point out that I think that wave of young people indignant at the disempowerment of living under a dictatorship, I think that's going to come back to our own imperfect democracies in the West in time. None of us live under a perfect democratic system. You know, the will of the people is not expressed precisely in the structures of governance that we have. And I think that this wave of democratisation is going to go deeper and longer than we think about, perhaps. So.
In your system, in your natural system,
Yes.
physical world,
Yeah.
what, I mean, I don't believe there is any who or there is any God, but what this has to be,
What decides?
what and where?
Yeah, yeah. Sure. Look, I think what I see in the Earth system is that information systems organise matter, and the information system that is DNA organises matter in particular ways that that recapitulate themselves at different levels of hierarchy. So at the level of an organism, the organising principle, the DNA, has organised a body that is self-regulating, creates conditions that are ideal within the body for the continuation of the body. At the level of the superorganism, we see the same we see a recapitulation of the same thing, although it's not quite as complete at the superorganism level. Yeah, what we see there is species cooperating to keep conditions stable within the superorganism and ideal for the growth of their food sources and for the continuation of the individuals within that colony. At the global level, we see a similar sort of thing. It's yet less complete than at the superorganism level, yeah? But geopheromones and so forth do seem to allow the system some degree of self-regulation. And I think what I'm talking about now with the development of a global intelligence is really just another step in that process. What that is the organising principle of life, throwing up a system that is potentially able to give a better regulation, to regulate more precisely the Earth system. It's a global guiding intelligence, you know. So at that moment, there won't be a moment, but at a point in time where humans become deeply integrated in the system in a positive way to promote productivity and stability of the Earth system rather than destroy it, you can think of the Gaia of the ancient Greeks as having come into existence. And by that, I mean the ancient Greeks believed that Gaia, the Earth, was a perfect, whole and complete creature. Yeah? And creatures have command and control systems, and they are very tightly regulated. So in a sense, I think that there is a recapitulation of what the information system is creating at every level in the system, if that answers the question.
I have one more. Is intelligence the process of the same system?
Yeah, yes. Everything we see about us is a creation of evolution by natural selection. Everything. Our society. I mean, ants and humans have created great civilizations without the use of reason, as you know, as Ed Wilson said. This is everything about us. The love we feel for each other. Everything is a creation of evolution by natural selection. So it is, yeah. So yeah.
When a species like mankind has the ability to direct its own evolution and manipulate evolution, as we now have, is it still evolution or has it become something else?
Oh, of course it's still evolution. The selective pressure's just changed. I think it is. And you know, something very unusual happened when evolution created this thing called self-awareness, and that was the key, in a way, I think, to allowing us to become what we are. Because, you know, we are on the cusp of being able to turn around and say, well, actually, I don't like that gene. I think I'll just snip it out using gene shears, you know. So that's changed things. And of course, the reason we've gone through a demographic transition is self-awareness. Our genes would love us to keep reproducing ad infinitum, but we say, actually, no, you know, I'd like some resources just to lead a better life. I'd like my kids, my 2 or 1 children, to have the resources they require to have a good and satisfying life. So it's a form of selfishness, in a way, that's brought about by self-awareness that acts in the interest of the planetary system. And that really interests me, that it's another great paradox, and I don't know where to take it, but I can see it operating. So, yes.
You seem optimistic that humanity can save itself. I'm not as pessimistic as Peter Ward.
Yes, right.
Although I like his ideas. But my suspicions is that population will expand so much that before our rationality can save us, it will collapse. And a small number of us will survive despite our intellect. Would you comment?
Sure. Well, I think if small numbers of us survive, the global superorganism that we are just in the midst of creating will have to perish. That depends upon global cooperation, yeah? So we will go back to being just like another powerful individual species on the planet, you know, really. And that, I think, will spell disaster, particularly in a tribal world, you know, armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. So that is the Medea hypothesis. That's the worst case scenario. In terms of population, we need to understand the reality of what's happening, and to do that, we need to look at the UN projections on population. Every 2 years, the UN gets together and does their projection for global population. The one last year was a landmark, you know, because for the first time ever since they've been doing these projections, the projected peak population at 2050 was lower than the one for the previous projection period by about 40 million. Not much, but a little bit. And that really gave me hope, and it interested me. So I looked at the assumptions they use in their modelling. And it was very, very interesting what they've done. They've said, well, let's assume that humans will overcome the AIDS epidemic, right? So you think that'll lead to a bigger population. Let's assume that average family size in the developed countries actually increases over the next 40 years. Got to lead to bigger population, yeah? And yet the projection results are lower. Why? Because the trend that's already set in the poorest countries, the 48 poorest countries on the planet, is such that they'll go from a family size of 5.5 today through to 2.5 by 2050. Right? And that'll give us a population of 9 billion or so. Now, if that trajectory is a bit off, just say poverty increases and the quality of people's life declines, we may end up with 10 billion and growing by 2050. It's very finely balanced. If we direct our foreign aid budgets better and make sure that women particularly get the education they need and increased security, then we could end up with a population of 8 billion, which should be more comfortable. Yeah? And these are big numbers we're talking about here. Trying to feed and clothe and support those numbers of people is not going to be easy, but I do think it's possible.
Very intrigued by the point you touched on at the end of your lecture about the conquest of the galaxy within 5 million years.
Yeah.
And recently the Kepler Space Telescope predictions based on the data from that are that there are hundreds of millions of planets within habitable Goldilocks zones. And so if that's right, that there are hundreds of millions of other places where there could be life, it struck me from that very unlikely that we would be the first where intelligent superorganisms would arise. So I wonder if there's another explanation for why we haven't seen the wave of organization coming from some other superintelligent planet. And also just curious to understand how the 5 million figure was arrived at for colonizing.
Yeah, I'd have to go back to Enrico Fermi for that. I'm sorry, I don't have the figures at hand to justify that, but for the distance. But whether we're the first or not, I think one of the things that I didn't really get a chance to talk about there that gives me greater confidence we might be the first is just the incredible perilous course of evolution over the 4 billion years of the planet. You know, we came close to extinction 70,000 years ago as human beings when the Toba volcano erupted in Indonesia. We know there was a genetic bottleneck. There was only a few thousand surviving pairs of humans on the planet. We could have gone extinct back then. But that bottleneck was important in forming us today because all 7 billion of us, and we've just arrived at 7 billion this month as a global population, we are less genetically diverse than a random sample of 50 chimpanzees from Africa. Yeah? And that's had a huge impact on our ability, I think, to form a global superorganism. What it means is that a human smile is a smile anywhere on the planet. We have a commonality, a common humanity that we wouldn't have if we hadn't gone through that bottleneck. So when you look at, that's one event out of thousands we could look at that have influenced the course of human evolution through time. I wouldn't be at all surprised if we are the first. I think there's probably intelligent life elsewhere. Intelligent superorganisms, I don't think so.
Well, isn't there another explanation, though, in terms of the vast distances between solar systems, between the different star systems in our galaxy, and you're talking about these hundreds of thousands of light years?
Yeah.
Even if there is intelligent life elsewhere, wouldn't the vast distances also help explain why we wouldn't have seen it yet? Well,
I suppose what that theory suggests is that the evolution of global superorganisms has occurred within a few 100,000 years of each other on planets that are billions of years old. Possible, but again statistically unlikely, perhaps. Sorry, there's someone here.
Can you expand a little bit on Thomas Matthews and his projections that he made and how we've come to this point at present through like a brief timeline of global governance?
Sure. Well, Thomas Malthus was the one who explained that all populations increase exponentially, and yet the means to feed that population only increases arithmetically, so that populations will collapse and ecosystems, where he didn't say ecosystems, but you know, we now know ecosystems will collapse, and so we tend to perish through our own success. We are the first species to escape that. And Malthus, by the way, was writing in a period in Britain where family size was increasing, infant mortality was declining, and it really looked pretty grim. It looked as if he might be right. What he didn't know about was this demographic transition, where initially family size increased, then affluence increases, and then you get longevity, and then family size decreases, and you get down to the fourth stage, I think it is, of the demographic transition, where you reach a population equilibrium. But demographers are quite openly talking about a 5th stage of demographic transition where population starts to decrease. And that may well be the case. We have to see how that's going to go. But whatever, that's Malthus's basic insight. So we are now we're 100 years into the demographic transition. It's only going to run for another 40 years or so if the UN's right. And within that brief period, the human family will have gone through that transition. So yes.
One theory as to why we've not heard from other intelligent life is that whenever they discover nuclear power, they blow themselves up. The psychotic, miserable people that we even put in charge, Hitler, Stalin, Idi Amin, the head of Myanmar, Sudan, and so on, the chances of one of these crazy individuals not using nuclear power to attack somebody else, and if you combine that with the estimate you only need 6 or 7 nuclear bombs to give us a nuclear winter, I am not as optimistic as you about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, maybe that's the mechanism that does destroy the intelligent superorganism. Who can be sure? But you forgot among your list of leaders Herman Van Rompuy, who I think is actually more like the person we're going to get in future to lead countries. They're going to be dead boring, one hopes. They'll just get on with doing what's required and nothing more. But anyway.
You haven't talked too much about global climate change, but is there anything there that you see reason for hope? Because it seems like it's been difficult to curb that increasing CO2 in the atmosphere.
Yeah, look, I was going to cover that and I just ran out of time, but I can certainly cover it because that's really my core area of competency with this sort of stuff. I spent 3 years as chair of the Copenhagen Climate Council in the lead up to COP15, and I was pretty disappointed with the outcome of the meeting in the early days. I've now come to realise actually we achieved something that was quite significant. The Copenhagen Accord is a pretty important document for the future of humanity. Under that document, nations pledge a certain amount of emissions reductions, and if you tote up all the pledges, as Lord Stern has said, we get about 2/3 of the way we need to go in order to avoid dangerous climate change. So it's not the answer, but it's a big step on the way. The key question for us all now is, will nations honour those pledges? So when we disbanded the Copenhagen Climate Council in February 2010, all the members went away and said our job now is to go back into our countries to try to make sure that our nations honour the pledge under Copenhagen. That's why I took the job as Chief Climate Commissioner in Australia. Now, are they honouring the pledge? Okay, let's go around the table. China honoured their pledge last year for the initial reductions, which we know from our work at the Council that the technocrats were saying they could never achieve. And they only achieved it by closing down industries for a certain period of time. They are ferociously determined to make their targets, and they are very, very ambitious targets because they see that their future in the clean energy economy completely depends on it. In fact, the survival of the Communist Party depends on it. Europe has increased its ambition from 20% below 1990 levels to 25% and are on target to achieve that with the emissions trading scheme they have there. South Korea putting 2% of GDP now into the green economy and economic development to try to foster that. New Zealand's just developed an emissions trading scheme. Australia is in the midst of a battle to implement one so it can honour its commitment. California is going to have an emissions trading scheme, which is to be the keystone in terms of your commitments. At the national level in the US, it's easy to despair because you read Congress is acting a bit like King Canute, saying that climate change doesn't exist, and if we pass a bill to say it doesn't exist, we'll be all right. Anyway, but I met Obama's climate advisor a week ago in Washington, and he was just commented that the US commitment is minus 17% below 2005 levels by 2020. You're already at minus 9%. Yeah. Partly because of the economic slowdown, but partly also because of other programs. Your new CAFE standards are going to make a big difference. A lot of what you're doing is focused on transport because there's a bipartisan agreement that energy security is important, and these are programs under that. The situation's not ideal, but the people in Washington are quietly confident that you'll achieve your target. The big question is what will happen in the next commitment period beginning 2020. Because over this decade, even if we all honour our commitments and get that extra third, we will have used up about half of the carbon budget that we have out to 2050 if we want to avoid dangerous climate change. It's not ideal to be using 50% of your resource over a 25% time period. Yeah? So we know that the curve has to get much steeper over the next few commitment periods. And the great challenges there, we need to be looking at them now and building the agreements and infrastructure that are required now for them to really bite come 2020. It's still in the balance.
I've got a simple technical question you may know the answer to, though. It's pretty simple. I've heard that if there were a switch to nuclear energy, that what's required in terms of using fossil fuels and other climate-disturbing mechanisms to fuel the nuclear fuel program is such that you don't have a net gain, or you may even have a net loss. Do you have any comment on how that plays out?
Sure. Look, it's interesting with all of this stuff. The figures are disputed because so much is at stake, and there's a lot of advertising and lies and all sorts of things, even at the detail level. I know when the Toyota Prius came to Australia, the hybrid car, there was all sorts of lies about it. People saying either if you look at the whole of life cycle for the vehicle, it's actually costs more greenhouse gases than the conventional cars. Rubbish. But anyway. In terms of nuclear power, I'm no expert in the area, but what I have seen, the analyses I've seen, one of the great determinants of the overall impact is the quality of the fuel you start with. So if you're mining high quality uranium resources close to where you need to get them, you're in a much better position than if you've got to chase much lower quality ore. But I think that from what I've seen of the assessments, it does have an impact. It does reduce greenhouse gases. China is madly pursuing nuclear power now. I suppose we'll know in a decade or so how effective that's been, but going from 7% of the energy mix to 22% by 2030. So that's a very ambitious program. So, yes.
When you were last here in Los Angeles, it was like 2009, on another book tour, and you were talking about the global climate change debate in our country at that time, and you were optimistic that already, this is before Copenhagen, it just started, that the world was moving ahead of the U.S. The only country that was still dragging its feet was the right wing in this country. Yeah. And unfortunately, in this country, it seemed to have gotten worse rather than better, at least politically. But are you still optimistic that eventually the world will drag the U.S. back to the mainstream, or are we going to have to fight this battle all over again?
Very hard to say. But could I just say that, look to the north, there's a Canada, the Harper government has been very much on the right wing of all of this and, doing very little. The election on Monday is going to sort that out. It's interesting that the party that's doing the best is the left-leaning New Democratic Party up there, so we'll see. I think politics is impossible to predict. But could I just say one thing that drives me nutty is the way we often engage with the day-to-day, and we're looking at the news cycle and we're seeing insulting and stupid articles by ignorant people, right, saying climate change doesn't exist, and we react and then we get depressed about it all. Doing that is about as sensible as investing your pension or your retirement funds in the stock market and then checking every 5 minutes to see if you're going to end up retiring rich or poor. We need to take a longer view of it, and we need to look at the progress we've made over time. And 2005, 6 years ago, an inconvenient truth hadn't been released. The scientists were tearing their hair out about climate change, but the level of awareness in the public was low. Since then, we've not only had increased public awareness globally, we've had the biggest meeting of heads of government ever in the history of our species over climate change. Every major government around the world has a climate policy in place. All the major emitters, 80% of them, have commitments under the Copenhagen Accord. That's in 6 years. I hesitate to think where we're going to be in 2020. It's unpredictable, but on that scale we are making progress. Not fast enough and not enough, but we can't deny the progress we are making. Sorry.
Can you talk a little bit more about the UN population estimates? I mean, what I see is that we have all the major world religions decry birth control at any time. Many of them decry education, particularly for women. The tax systems reward large families. There is no incentive to have a small family other than pressure of not having enough food. I wonder where their estimates are coming from.
Well, with all of that being true, the demographic transition is still taking place. I think simply because the power of selfishness is so great. And once people have something to lose, they want something for themselves, you know. So you're quite right, there's religious groups who are having large families still. There's Saudi Arabia is a good example, you know, a relatively developed country with an average family size of 5.5, you know. But they are the exception, and they're not skewing the demographic. They're not powerful enough to alter this great juggernaut that's happening globally, started 100 years ago and will finish 40 years from now. Sorry.
You know, you're only saying that the demographic transition is happening, but you also said that the prediction of the world population was 40 million more than actually has been discovered to be. If Peter Ward were standing up there and talking about the Medea hypothesis, he would say that that was evidence of just the opposite of what you're saying. You know, it's evidence that the population and the human race is declining and collapsing. It could predict, it would mean the same thing. There's no reason why you would say one rather than the other.
So we have to know what the cause of death is and what the pattern is demographically to answer that question. And could I just clarify by saying that the 2010 UN projection projected a population of 40 million less, not 40 million more, right, for this projection period, right?
So it's continuing to increase.
No, it's going down. The peak population of 2050, as estimated in 2010, was 40 million less than the 2008 projection. Right. And every projection before 2010 had gone up. This is the first one that's gone down.
Would say we're collapsing.
Yeah, sure.
It's exactly what he would predict.
Sure.
It's evidence for the opposite of what you're saying.
And we can test that hypothesis, which is simply look at the cause of mortality, yeah? And if we were dying through the ravages of diseases and other causes of mortality, I'd agree with him. But that's not what's happening. What is driving the demographic change is a decline in family size. So it's family planning, the education of women and so forth that is declining, causing the decline in family size. It started in Europe 100 years ago and in this country. It's happened in China now. It's slowly happening in India. And the last bastion of the large families is the 46 poorest countries on the planet. And they are slowly now starting to shift. And within 40 years, we'll be down at 2.5, according to the UN.
Well, in order for that transition to take place, you need to have education also.
That's right.
On that part of it.
It is.
Can you say that that's happening throughout the world as well?
Well, I don't have the figures on that, but I think the UN has done some work on that, and I remember their take-home message was that if you want to affect global population, the key indicator, the key thing to affect is the education of women and their economic standing. So if you do that, it's the most effective way of causing a decline in family size.
What's the total for 2050?
It's 9.15 billion. With a chance of 8 billion if we can accelerate the development of the poorest countries, and a chance of 10 billion and still growing if it doesn't happen as fast as the UN projection, the median projection suggests. So there's a big difference. It is sort of the moment of decision, really.
On the colonization of the galaxies, it's actually just a basic geometric growth ratio. If you have a species that creates self-replicating robotic spacecraft, which essentially they all will be anyway, since we're already merging with computers ourselves, and according to Ray Kurzweil, by 2029, now 2040 is up to a few years, we will have achieved, you know, human-level intelligence in computers, and we'll merge with the computers, and we'll be on the matrix. Essentially, and so that is a simple step to create self-replicating robots that you send out. So you send one out, and there's 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64. Before you know it, 5 million years later, every possible planet would have been touched. Even if some of them crash and they break or whatever, there's just so many of them out there. Therefore, where are they? Well, there's a book about this, I think it's called Where Are They? Like the 50 answers to Fermi's paradox. One of which is that they are here. And there's two species of them, the reptilians and the grays, and they're in New Mexico, living underground. But no one takes that one too seriously. I do worry about the idea that we're first. I always figure as soon as you think that, Copernicus is going to whisper in your ear, remember, you're not special. Because we always think we're special, but it always turns out we're not. So there is that assumption. But, or another answer is like what just happened to the Allen array of telescopes. Maybe they just run out of money. And private donors say, I'm not going to give you any more money, and the governments go broke because they fund other, whatever. There's all those issues as well. Anyway, thank you so much. That was a